The Japanese Tsunami, 2011, by Lauren Tarshish. On the afternoon of March 11, 2011, the students and teachers of Kamaishi East Junior High School in Kamaishi, Japan, were getting ready for after-school activities. 14-year-old Aki Kawasaki was excited about basketball practice. Kana Sasaki was getting dressed for tennis. Fumiya Akasaki, captain of the boys judo team, was headed for the gym. Shin Saito, English teacher and badminton coach, was tying his shoes. It was a typical Friday afternoon, that is, until 2:46 p.m., when a massive earthquake began to rumble 20 miles below the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The quake, about 40 miles off the northeastern shore of Japan, was 1,000 times more powerful than the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. It sent shockwaves hundreds of miles in every direction. In Tokyo, office buildings swayed like blades of grass. Subways stopped underground. In Kamaishi, a town on Japan's beautiful northwestern coast, buildings shook violently. Gaping holes opened in the streets. The students and teachers of Kamaishi East rushed for cover. Computers, books, and furniture crashed to the floor around them. People screamed, but their cries couldn't be heard over the sound of the quake. There was something that people would talk about for years to come, the sound of the earthquake's roar, as if a monstrous beast had awakened deep inside the earth. Most earthquakes just last for a few seconds, blasting out quick bursts of destruction. This quake was different. It went on and on like an endless nightmare. It continued for nearly 6 minutes, the shaking, the roaring, the crashing, the shattering terror. When the earth finally stopped shaking, there was a moment of eerie quiet. Like most schools in Japan, the Kamaishi East building had been carefully built to withstand earthquakes. Even after 6 minutes of violent shaking, the building stood strong. Fortunately, none of the students and teachers was seriously injured. But there was no feeling of relief for Aiki, Kana, Fumiya, or any other students at Kamaishi East. They knew that the disaster was just beginning. The quake under the ocean floor had triggered a tsunami, a series of massive waves. The waves were hundreds of miles wide and were racing across the ocean at jet speeds. Just a few yards high at first, the waves would grow stronger and bigger. In some places, they would reach as high as 133 feet as they approached the shore. Within 30 minutes, the waves would hit Japan's northeastern coast with the force of the most powerful bombs. Earthquake warnings. Few places on Earth are as prone to earthquakes and tsunamis as Japan. Small quakes hit the country every single day. Most are so mild that the ground barely shakes. But over the past century alone, major earthquakes have turned modern cities to rubble. The worst was in 1923, when a major quake hit Tokyo. Fires broke out, and within days, much of the city was a smoldering ruin. More than 140,000 people died. Other major quakes have caused devastating damage to the cities of Kyoto and Kobe. Over the past few decades, Japan has done more than any other country to protect its citizens from earthquakes. Building laws are strict. Newer skyscrapers, schools, and other structures are designed to sway rather than crumble when ground below shakes. Japan also has the world's most advanced earthquake warning system. Sensors around the country can detect the very first stages of an earthquake. The first shock waves what happen minutes before the most serious shaking begins. Alerts are sent out over cell phones. These few precious minutes of warning can mean the differences between life and death. Drivers can pull off to the side of a highway. Subway conductors can halt their trains. Doctors and nurses can stop a delicate surgery before the shaking starts. Japan also has a system designed to protect against tsunamis. In fact, Kamaishi was famous throughout Japan for the world's largest tsunami wall. The gigantic barrier of steel and concrete was 1 mile long, 297 feet deep, and rose 20 feet above the water. It cost $1 billion and even earned a spot in the Guinness World Records as the biggest seawall ever built. Tsunamis had destroyed the city twice in the past 150 years, once in 1896 and again in 1933. Town leaders believed that their new wall would hold back even the most violent tsunami waves. Not everyone was so sure. The leaders of Kamaishi's schools have reason to be especially worried about tsunamis. Several of the city's schools were within striking distance of large waves. If a tsunami hit, students and teachers would be in grave danger. And so, even as the Great Tsunami Wall was being built, the school leaders were working on their own plan for keeping students safe. The idea was that they would turn Kamaishi's middle school students into tsunami experts. The more students knew, school leaders believed, the more likely they would be to survive if a tsunami struck. So, at Kamaishi East and other middle schools, tsunami education has become part of every class. In social studies, students researched the 1933 event and other tsunamis and their effects on the city. In science, they learned how tsunamis form. In language arts, they wrote essays about the 1896 tsunami. They drew hazard maps showing the likely paths of the waves. They explored the area around the school, searching out the highest points. They even learned to cook soup for people in disaster shelters. The school also held frequent tsunami drills. Students were taught to gather outside the school while teachers took attendance. They would then wait for an announcement on the loudspeaker instructing them to walk to a refugee area, a parking lot about 10 minutes away. But when the quake struck, most students immediately realized that what they had practiced in the drills would not work. They could tell that this quake was incredibly powerful, likely stronger than any recent earthquakes. They had no doubt that the tsunami was already speeding right for them. There was no time to stand in the courtyard. The electricity had been knocked out, so no announcement would be coming. It was up to them to lead the escape, a life or death race with the wave. There was not 1 minute to spare. With panicked shouts, students urged their teachers to follow them as they rushed for higher ground. "Before I realized I was running, my feet were moving," Kana would later say. Teachers at the elementary school next door had plans to keep their young students on their building's 3rd floor. The sight of the older students rushing away changed their minds. Soon, hundreds of students and teachers were in a frantic dash for safety. Older children grabbed the younger ones and carried them on their backs. "I thought the tsunami would come," said Aki. "I was desperately trying to escape." They reached the parking lot refuge area but decided that it was not high enough. Again, older students helped the younger ones, grabbing their hands, pushing them along. They continued on, climbing higher into the hills. They finally came to rest in a parking lot on a hill. Terrified and out of breath, they had a clear view of the horrific scene unfolding in their city just below. A black raging river. The ocean had begun its attack. Just 30 minutes after the earthquake, a black wave hit. The tsunami wall crumbled like a sandcastle. Many people had climbed up the wall, believing that they would be safe. All were swept away. Water rushed into the streets, rising so quickly that cars, trucks, homes, and people were swallowed in seconds. The water, now a black raging river filled with debris, boats, and wrecked homes, rushed deeper into the city and up into the hills. The students watched in shock as their school was engulfed. At the elementary school, a car, lifted by the waters, crashed into the building's 3rd floor, exactly where the teachers had plans to wait with the children after the quake. If they had stayed, they would have likely been killed. Similar scenes were unfolding up and down Japan's coast. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of small cities, bustling town, quaint fishing villages, and quiet farming communities were disappearing under the water. The sea water traveled farther inland than anyone imagined it could. Miles from the ocean, towns were overwhelmed. And then, like a monster returning to its lair, the water was sucked quickly back into the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of people who had survived the quake and waves were swept out to sea. In the hours after the quake and the tsunami, Aki, Kana, and Fumiya stood amid a group of hundreds of stunned students and teachers. They eventually made their way to one of the city's surviving school buildings, where they found no food, water, or lights. They spent the night there, shivering in the cold, terrified for their families. They went to another school the next day, and the full picture of the disaster started to become clear. They learned that much of Kamaishi was gone, that hundreds of people had died, and that many more were missing. Most of the students' homes were lost. 14 students lost one or both parents. Aki, Kana, and Fumiya were among the lucky. Their families were safe. Finding hope. The disaster that hit Japan on March 11, 2011, is now known as the Great Tohoku Earthquake. The earthquake was the strongest to ever strike Japan and the fourth most powerful in all recorded history. But it was this tsunami that caused the most death and destruction. Approximately 18,000 people were killed. 100,000 buildings were destroyed. In some areas of the coast, the water rose to a staggering 133 feet. Hundreds of communities were destroyed. Bustling cities, beautiful villages, vibrant towns, centuries-old neighborhoods. For miles in every direction, there was nothing left but toxic mud littered with the wreckage of homes and businesses. Tanker ships had been dragged miles from the sea. Smashed cars teetered on buildings. And there was another disaster unfolding in a town called Fukushima. Tsunami waves had badly damaged nuclear power plants. Toxic radiation was leaking into the air, endangering hundreds of thousands of people. As far away as Tokyo, 150 miles away, many people braced for a full-blown nuclear meltdown. This kind of nuclear disaster had happened only once before in history, in Chernobyl, a town located in what is now the country of Ukraine. Today, hundreds of square miles around the ruined Chernobyl power plant are so poisoned by radiation that no humans live there. For weeks after the quake and tsunami, many feared that the same could happen in Japan. It is hard to imagine the horror and fear that gripped the country. But amid the hopelessness, many found inspiration in the story of the students of Kamaishi East. Not one student or teacher died in this disaster. The story of students quickly spread around the country. Most agree it was the years of preparation and the quick thinking of the students that made the difference. "I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them," Mr. Sato said. And it's the students who have given us hope and strength to move on.